Good evening and welcome to Insight. On this episode, we will be discussing the present and future of Albania in a conversation with Albanian historian and author Olsi Jazexhi. But first, this brief analysis.
Albania is a small country we rarely hear about in the news. One of the reasons for this is that the US decided to turn this southern Balkan state on the Adriatic coast into a base of operations against Russia and Muslim countries such as Iran and Turkey in the early 2000s. Beyond its geographic location, it is the fact that Albania is the only Muslim-majority nation in Europe, with approximately 70% of the population adhering to Islam, that made it a target for US domination. Following the collapse of communism in the 1990s, the US aggressively expanded its strategic presence into Eastern Europe and the Balkans, including into Albania. Albania had been ruled by the communist dictator Enver Hoxha for decades, who proclaimed Albania to be the first officially atheist state in the world and who actively persecuted all religious activity. Despite this severe repression, Hoxha was not successful in extinguishing the religious beliefs of the Albanians, particularly the Muslim population. After the collapse of communist rule, Albanians revived religious life and re-established connections with their fellow Muslim brethren in the Muslim Ummah, particularly with Iran, Turkey and Saudi Arabia. This caused an alarm in the United States and Europe, who feared the emergence of a majority Muslim country on the European continent, with close strategic relations with the mentioned Muslim nations. A strategic campaign was initiated by the United States and its vassals to first strategically deny Albania to the Muslim world and to once again de-Islamize Albania, this time by using the excuse of fighting terrorism to ban all contacts between official Albanian Muslim organizations with any Muslim organizations from Iran, Turkey and Arab countries. After the failure of the US-backed and Emirati-financed coup d'etat in Turkey against President Erdogan, the religious affairs of the Sunni Muslims in Albania was handed over to the pro-US and pro-Zionist Gulenist cult headquartered in the US state of Pennsylvania, a cult which played a key role in the attempted coup d'etat in Turkey. All Albanian Muslim clerics who opposed the imposition of the Gulenist cult on their country were persecuted, imprisoned, or exiled. The US also forced the Albanian government to accept the permanent encampment of the remnants of the Rajavi terrorist cult on its soil, a cult responsible for the murder of over 17,000 people in Iran since the 1970s, a terrorist cult that the Iraqi government expelled after the end of Saddam's rule because of its crimes against the Iraqi people during that era. Albania was forced to accept them after literally no other country in the world would accept them on their soil. The US strategic campaign for Albania also weaponized the legitimate nationalist feelings of Albanians and the Albanian majority population in neighboring Kosovo to turn that region into a base against Serbia and Russia. In pursuit of these strategies, the United States, through its embassy and through organizations such as the Soros Foundation, has captured and bought the Albanian political leadership, similar to the fashion it bought and captured elites in countries such as Ukraine. This puppet elite is committing the same crimes and abuses that other US-backed elites in other Muslim nations are committing, with the same result of turning the people against anyone and anything related to America. It appears the Albanian people are beginning to resist this US diktat and will eventually replace the current leadership controlled by the US with leaders who will re-establish relations with important Muslim nations in accordance with Albania's real national interests and the deep-held religious beliefs of its people.
Dr. Jazexhi, thank you so much for joining us. You know, there's not many programs done on Albania. It's a relatively small country. It's one that maybe the big news organizations might not want to spend a lot of time on. It is also one of those countries which is very interestingly completely dominated by the West. A lot of stories going on there that if it was in any other country, it would be headline news. And yet we see that absolutely nothing is talked about it. And you've, of course, done a lot of interesting work on this in terms of the articles you've written and the research you've done. Also very brave of you to do this, given the situation that exists in Albania. You at the moment, are not in Albania, maybe for good reasons also. So I think what's important is that we talk about Albania and maybe just get the facts out in the first instance to our viewers about what's really going on in Albania, which you will then lay out for us. And also then maybe spend a little time analyzing it, maybe more than just getting the information out, talking about why is it that it is the way it is, and what could be in the future. It's very interesting. You've described the leaders in Albania as our little Zelenskys, which is a very interesting but also very entertaining way of stating a fact that maybe we have an elite, we are dealing with an elite in Albania, which has been completely captured by the West and by the Americans. So if you could please, to start us off, give us a brief introduction into what's going on in Albania. What are the issues as far as you have been able to report them and talk to them about, and let us know what's going on in Albania for our viewers.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Albania is probably the oldest and the only fully recognized Muslim majority country in Europe. Albania was created as a country in 1913 after the First Balkan War, when the powers of Europe did not know what to do with the Muslims of Europe. But from the moment that Albania was created, it was an experimental state. Albania was not allowed to be a Muslim country, even though we are majority Muslim. We were cut from the rest of the Muslim Ummah. We were secularized. Islam was removed, and Albania was treated as an Italian colony until Second World War. After the Second World War, Albania became part of the Soviet Union. We were an independent country. We were a country that supported Palestine, supported the Islamic Revolution of Iran, even though the country was atheist and Stalinist. The ruler of Albania, Enver Hoxha, praised Imam Khomeini as a great revolutionary and leader of the Muslim world. And Albania played a very important role on denouncing American and Israeli imperialism in the Middle East. But what happened in Albania in 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union, we had a regime change. And the Americans removed the communist government that we had, and they promised that they will bring democracy to us. Nevertheless, what happened after the first decade of 1990s, in 2000, when American foreign policy towards the world of Islam changed, American policies towards Albania changed as well. While in 1990s, Albania enjoyed freedom, democracy, and in a way, country was re-Islamized. Muslims, people like me, because we were not allowed to keep Muslim names during time of communism, so we discovered our Islamic roots. Countries like Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia came and helped the Muslim community to revive itself. Nevertheless, starting from the year 2000 and onwards, the Americans, and in particular the Soros Foundation, they intervened in our local democracy. We had a civil war in 96, 97 in the country. And from that moment, they brought to power the ex-communists who were socialists. Together with them, they brought Edi Rama to power, the person who now is our Prime Minister, who was a close friend of George Soros and the international bankers, friends of Soros. Now, after the coming of Rama to power, he came together with Fatos Nano in the year 2000s, and then he came back to power in 2014. The governments that have been formed in Albania under the ruling Socialist Party of Edi Rama, they have been dominated by US Embassy and Soros Foundation. So if you know Albanian politics, most ministers that we have, the evangelical and Zionist mayor of Tirana, Erion Veliaj, they are all handpicked by the US Embassy in Tirana, and they are byproduct of Soros Foundation. So why I call them Zelenskys? I call them Zelenskys because at the same way as the Americans and Soros and other Zionist bankers installed to power a clone like Vladimir Zelensky, the same thing the Americans have done in Albania, but not only, even in Kosovo, in Macedonia, in Montenegro, and many countries in the Balkans. So we in Eastern Europe, we don't have a democracy anymore. For somebody to be elected as a member of parliament in Albania, but in Kosovo as well, your name have to pass through US Embassy or Soros Foundation. So what has happened to us in Eastern Europe, and in particular in Albania, since the year 2000 and onward, we have undergone a massive change into our system. Number one, what the Americans have done with us in Eastern Europe, they have destroyed democracy. Number two is they destroyed the socialist economy that we had. In time of communism, we in Eastern Europe, we enjoyed free housing provided by the state, free healthcare, free education. But especially since 2014, when Edi Rama took power as a prime minister in our country, he have destroyed the social welfare of our state. We no longer have free health care in the country. No longer we have free university education. And moreover, people like our Prime Minister Edi Rama, who has been a member of Soros Foundation, and his wife, Linda Rama, she has been the director-in-chief of Soros Foundation in Albania. The strategy that Americans have followed from Albania to Ukraine is debt entrapment. So what they do is they have put our countries from Ukraine to Albania into huge debts, and as a result, they are increasing prices. So if, let us say, in Albania, 10 or 20 years ago, we paid for our water bill in a month probably $3 to $4. Nowadays, an average Albanian citizen pays like $20 a month. What is happening is that countries like Ukraine or Albania have been enslaved by international bankers, people whom the Soros mafia brings along. And they use a strategy of, number one, destruction of our local economies, imposition of their puppets into power, and imposition of the policies that Soros and Washington wants people in Eastern Europe to follow.
Dr. Jazexhi, let's talk a little bit about some of these policies, because we know let's give it some substance and meat in terms of what's going on there. Why don't we start, maybe if you could explain for us how they were able to hand the entire religious, the Muslim part of the religious life in Albania to the Gulenist cult, one that was unsuccessful. They tried to do it in Turkey to turn Turkey into this base for this, what we would in Iran call American Islam. And they were unsuccessful in Turkey with the policies that the Erdogan government took there and the arrests that they made after the coup d'etat. But what they ended up doing is they handed Albania to the Gulenists. So if you could talk about that, and also if you could talk about, which is maybe more important for us in Iran, is how is it that the Rajavi terrorist cult, which was, you know, in Iraq and is currently also in Paris, the leadership is in Paris, but the people that were brainwashed into this cult that lived in Iraq for 40 years, 30, 40 years, how is it that they've ended up in Albania now? Why Albania?
Well, the history of Islam in Albania is complicated. During time of communism, Albania was declared an atheist state. In 1990s, when democracy came, Albanians embraced Islam again. Majority of Albanians are Sunni Muslims, but a large group of Bektashi Muslims exist. And the Bektashis, they are Shia Ithna Ashari Sufi sect. And in 1990s and in early 2000, Albanian Muslims established bridges with the Muslim Ummah, with countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and in particular Turkey and Iran. The bridges that Muslims of Albania built with the Muslim Ummah worried the Americans a lot. And in the 2000s, when Bush declared his global war on terror, which was a war on Islam, the Americans started a project in Albania to take control of the Muslim community of Albania. The Muslim community of Albania is the state institution. Like in Iran, you have the Seminary of Qom, which manages Islam. From 2003 to 2005, I have been advisor to the chief mufti of Albania. And I have witnessed firsthand how the Americans, by using the anti-terror police of our country, removed from the structures of our Sunni Muslim community the clerics who were educated in the Arab world, but even in Turkey. There was a project which the Albanian and the American government coordinated together, which aimed to give control of Islam in Albania to the Gulenist sect. The Gulenist sect were brought in Albania for a number of reasons. First, they were brought as a pilot project in order to fight the revolutionary Islam, which started to grow in Albania in early 2000. By revolutionary Islam, I mean Muslims who were sympathetic to policies of Turkey and Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East. The Americans do not want a revolutionary Islam to exist in Europe, and in particular in Albania, which is the only Muslim majority country after Kosovo in Europe. So what they did is they brought the Gulenists in the structure of the Muslim community, and they gave to the Gulenists control over the madrasas and the only Islamic university that we have in Albania, Badr University. I have written several articles for the Yearbook of Muslims in Europe, where I analyze Islam in Albania. And the declarations that many Albanian politicians have done in years show that the US Embassy instructed our leaders in early 2000 to remove, through illegal forms, the clerics from the structures of the Muslim community who were educated in Arab countries or even in Turkey. I'm talking here about the Sunni Muslims.
That's right.
And to replace them with the Gulenists. Now, when in 2016 we had the coup d'etat in Turkey against the democratically elected government of Erdogan, and from this moment onward, but even before that, Turkey was very concerned about the presence of the Gulenists. Now, I have to explain to your viewers that the present ambassador, US ambassador in Albania, Yuri Kim, she was a close friend to Osman Kavala, one of the people who is jailed in Turkey, accused of organizing the coup. So, especially after 2016, Albania has become a base of the Gulenists, and the American ambassador is one of the chief persons who, in a way, coordinated the coup against democracy in Turkey. And in this moment that we're speaking, there are many protests in Albania by Muslim clerics who want to have their position in the Muslim community, but they are not allowed. The elections in our Muslim community, whenever we have, they are done under the supervision of the US Embassy and anti-terror police. So clerics who are educated in Sunni countries like Malaysia, Turkey, or the Arab world, they are not allowed to enter into this institution. So imagine if the Americans would have done this to Iran, to force a sect in Qom and to prohibit other clerics from having access.
They actually tried to do that during the Shah, but of course they were not successful. So,
yes.
So also then please explain to us, because we have an actual terrorist cult organization now that is in Albania. Again, for us in Iran, very important, because they killed 17,000 people in Iran, which is the Rajavi cult that used to be in Iraq. And when the Saddam regime was overthrown by the US, they end up in Albania. How did that happen? If you could give us a little background on them coming to Albania. And by the way, sorry, doctor, we have to also mention a lot of these people are brainwashed, because what ended up happening is a lot of them, when they got off the plane or when they arrived in Albania, they actually defected. They ran away because it was the first time that they were allowed to leave that encampment that they had lived in for decades in Iraq. They weren't even allowed to leave that encampment in Iraq during the decades that they lived there. So the minute they got off the plane, or the minute they entered Albania, approximately half of them, this is what the media was reporting, approximately half of them actually fled from that cult and sought asylum in different parts of Europe.
Yeah, you are correct. Rajavi cult was brought in Albania. They started to come since 2013. At first, the Americans brought them to Albania under the excuse that they had to bring only some of their leaders. But then the bulk of this cult was brought under the Obama administration, and it was the Secretary of State, John Kerry, who came to Albania and brought 3,000 of them. The Americans had big problem with Iraq, because Iraqis knew very well who the Rajavi cult were, and they have committed many crimes against the people of Iraq.
That's
and
right.
They were looking for a safe haven for these terrorists. They tried to send these terrorists in many countries. They approached Macedonia, Romania, probably even Ukraine, but many countries of Eastern Europe simply refused to host these terrorists. So they brought them to Albania. Now, the question that many international scholars ask is, why Albania? The reason is simple. The Albanian government is a mafia government. For people who know local Albanian politics, most of our politicians, we have even government ministers, are drug dealers and who involve themselves in drug trafficking. So
you're saying that the organized crime is interwoven with the government there. There's not a line between organized crime and the government. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, in this moment that we are speaking together, we have two ministers of our Prime Minister Edi Rama, the Interior Minister Saimir Tahiri, who even welcomed the Mujahedeens, and the ex-minister of economy, Lefter Koka, who are in jail. One of them is for stealing state funds, and the other is for being part of Ndrangheta. So,
I'm sorry, doctor, we have to explain. Ndrangheta is one of the Italian organized crime organizations of southern Italy.
Yeah, so 'Ndrangheta is one of the most dangerous branches of Italian mafia.
Yes.
So as you can imagine, people from our Prime Minister Edi Rama to even the President as well, they are people who have huge files by the Americans and the American drug agency DEA. So what Americans do with our politicians, they use blackmail in order to force them to do anything that the Americans want. So in the case of Albania, they are using our country as the trash bin of Europe, and in particular, they have turned Albania into the most staunch ally of Israel in the Muslim world, and one of the greatest enemies of Turkey and Iran. So the bulk of the Mujahedeens came to Albania in 2016, and as you rightly mentioned, after coming to Albania, there was mass defection from Rajavi cult, because unlike the Gulenists, who many of them are educated people, but they are brainwashed and they believe that Fethullah Gulen is the Imam Mahdi and they have to obey to him even when he takes actions against Turkey and Islam. The Mujahedeens in general, they are ignorant. They are people who, for the past 30 years, they have been abducted or cheated, taken from Iran, and they were kept in deserts in Iraq. Now, many of these people, because I have interviewed many of the defectors, they live in an utopian world. Maryam Rajavi, in their paramilitary camp that they had in Iraq, and they have in Albania now, in the town of Manus, she does not allow her members to communicate with their families, to watch TV, to talk to foreigners via internet, and to possess even smartphones. These people, they are not allowed to marry and to have contact to the outside world.
Exactly.
So these people, I mean, the Rajavi cult is a very apocalyptic cult. It's probably like Lord's Resistance Army, these people, they have very strange ideas about the world. But now, as you mentioned, is that after coming to Albania in 2016, many of the Rajavis, they came in contact with an open and generally free society, and there were mass defections. And now this was a nightmare for Maryam Rajavi, who rules this cult with threats and lies. She depicts herself to her followers like being a holy woman, and she depicts Masood Rajavi, who is dead since long time, like being a messenger of God. And many of the members of the cult, they simply ran away. Nowadays, in this moment that we are speaking in Albania, there are many members within the Rajavi cult who would like to flee, defect, and live a free life. However, the Albanian government, the US Embassy in Albania, and Rajavi itself, they keep their members close in the camp. They blackmail and threaten them, and they do not let them to
excuse me, let me just follow up on this. So, in other words, there are many who are now those brainwashed people who have finally, after decades, been able to see a different view of the world after being, kept inside the camp there in Iraq. They would want to maybe even seek asylum in Albania, or would want to maybe get help from the Albanian government to leave there, but the Albanian government is not helping them. Have I understood you correctly?
Yes, that is correct. And we have a number of defectors now who have managed to escape from the camp. And these defectors are attacked by Maryam Rajavi by using even the Albanian state. So any person who is part of the Rajavi cult, who for a moment would like to leave and to live in peace, to abandon this paramilitary organization, Rajavi immediately complains to the Albanian government, to the US Embassy, and she orchestrates a media campaign against these people. She threatens them, she accuses them of being agents of Iran, and she makes their life horrible. There are many members inside the Rajavi camp who would like to flee, who would like to marry, who would like to have a job, but they are afraid to leave the camp because if they leave the camp, Rajavi goes after them. And we have many stories in Albania of many of these ex-Mujahedeens who have left the camp, who were later arrested on fake charges by Albanian police. They were jailed for crimes they didn't commit. We had the example of Ehsan Bidi, one ex-Mujahedeen who was very active on denouncing in the media the crimes of Rajavi cult, whom Rajavi illegally forced the Albanian government to, without any charge, imprison him in a detention center for 2 years, and later on the Albanian government threw him to the Greek border, a fact that created a diplomatic incident between Greece and Albania, and the intention was to kill this person in the border. On the other hand, Rajavi, because for maintaining their paramilitary camp, Rajavi needs a lot of money. Their monthly charges for running the camp and keeping all the structure are somewhere between 2 to 3 million euros a month. Mm-hmm. In the first year of their coming to Albania, it seems the Saudis and Emiratis sponsored them, but probably in the last years, Saudis and Emiratis, they have cut their money. So what we are observing that the Rajavi cult is doing recently, and there was a big scandal in Albania a few weeks ago, many of the cult leaders, including Narges Abrishamchi, she is the sister of Mehdi Abrishamchi, who is the first husband of Maryam Rajavi. So Narges, with another Iranian defector, they were caught by Albanian police trafficking drugs to Italy. And Italy and Greece, they are very worried about the Mujahedeen presence in Albania. They are cooperating with the Afghan mafia. And there are claims that the Mujahedeens, because they have a huge smuggling and criminal network, and there are claims that Mujahedeens have even smuggled ISIS fighters into Europe. They are a great security threat for Albania, for Italy, for Greece, but even for France. But the problem with the Mujahedeens is that the Mujahedeens are in Albania for a purpose. While the Gulenists, they fight against the government of Turkey, the Mujahedeens are used to fight against the government of Iran.
Very good, Doctor. So let's, this is exactly we've come to a good point. So basically what we can then conclude, because of course you're a historian, you teach history at the Islamic University in Malaysia. So let's try to reach a conclusion from this. So basically the Americans, at some point in the early 2000s, decided that they need an Islamic country to serve as a base to be able to infiltrate, be able to operate within the Muslim world. And Albania seemed to be the best one because it was in Europe. There was a history of the history that you explained. There was what in political science would be called a kleptocracy, a rule of the thieves, which would allow them to infiltrate much easier and influence them much easier than many other countries where the rulers or the leaders might have to answer to the people actually in terms of what they do. So what we see now is, as you very nicely pointed out, that the two major countries in West Asia, the two ancient but also the new rising Muslim powers, one Sunni, one Shia, Turkey and Iran, who according to the former head of the MI6, he said that the future of West Asia is Iran and Turkey. That those countries like Saudi Arabia, which are based on oil, they don't really have a future. But you have two countries which have an ancient history and are capable of actually being strong, powerful countries leading the Muslim Ummah. We have now the Americans setting up shop in Albania, bringing these extremists, these cults, these people who are brainwashed in order to use them against these two countries. So this is very interesting. We also have to note here, this is maybe something that very few people know, the fascist party in Spain, the Vox party in Spain, officially was sponsored by the Rajavi cult, that they received money for their elections. Of course, this was the money that Saudi Arabia was channeling to them, to the fascist party in Spain, but it did it through the Rajavi cult. This is another interesting thing. So we can also say that one of the functions of the Rajavi cult in Europe is to funnel Saudi money to whoever needs to be funneled to without that the public realizing that it's Saudi money. So I want to go back, with your permission, to this idea of a kleptocracy, this idea of the country basically being very closely connected, the government of the country, the leadership, being closely connected to organized crime. Albania is actually a country that produces oil. This is something that very few people know. It actually is an oil-producing country. But from what I was reading in your articles, the Albanian people are not seeing any of that oil. Could you very briefly, because we don't have much time left, very briefly explain to us what is happening to Albania's oil? Who's getting the profits?
Well, Albania is an oil producing country which doesn't have oil for its people. And we are forced to export oil from outside. Albania produces in a year, I think, around 1 million tons of oil, but all our oil is being taken for zero money in return by an American-Canadian company called Bankers Petroleum, which is headed by the ex-general of NATO who bombed Yugoslavia, Wesley Clark. This company, which takes our oil and gives nothing to Albania in return, is being protected by US government itself. In 2017, because Bankers Petroleum, they use fracking in Albania, they destroyed a town known as Marinza, where they caused a huge explosion because of the fracking they were doing. And in that time, Albania's prosecutor general wanted to open a criminal case against this company, which evades and pays no tax and takes all the oil out of the country. And when the did this thing, he was blackmailed by US Ambassador in Albania, who now works for the State Department, Donald Lu, and the prosecutor general was removed from his job, and later he was charged for not declaring his properties. So we have almost the same situation like in Ukraine, where Joe Biden and US administration went against the prosecutor general of Ukraine, who wanted to make charges against Biden and a number of American oligarchs. So in Albania, we live in a jungle, like when it comes to US interests. And coming back to the Mujahedeens, if I may clarify this, Mujahedeens are kept in Albania because Israeli Mossad needs them. They are in a way used by Mossad to attack Iran, to create as much as possible enmity and fake news about Iran in Europe. And during the era of the Trump administration, for people who have followed my articles, they even created a number of so-called fake terrorist incidents in Europe where they were blaming Iran. The reason was that the Israeli government is fighting a proxy war with Iran in Europe. That was the time when Iran was still in the nuclear deal, and Israelis played every card they could in order to scare the Europeans. And the attacks of the Mujahedeens or the Munafiqins, how you call them, against Iran, culminated in March 2018 when they make a fake claim as if Iran wanted to make a terrorist act in Albania. Me and my colleagues who are journalists, we proved that this was a fake news, but this fake news, which was taken by American media like Fox News and others, was used as a justification to boot out of Albania the Iranian ambassador.
Exactly.
So coming back to the system in Albania nowadays is, even though in appearance country looks to be European, open and free, the situation is very much similar to what happens in Ukraine under Zelensky, where you have gangs that rule, and on the top of the gangs you have the US Embassy.
Doctor, okay, so we had some very heavy issues that we were discussing, and it seems that the present is a little, heavy and depressing. But what I want to ask you is about the future. Are there people in Albania who are more nationalist-minded, who are maybe more willing to implement policies and govern the country in a way that's more in favor of the interest of the Albanian people, that is maybe going in the direction of establishing those links again with the Muslim world, whether it's Turkey or Iran or the Arab countries? How do you see the future? Is there hope for the future?
Albanians were the most pro-American people in Eastern Europe and in Balkans during the last decades. And this was because the Americans helped the Albanians during the Yugoslav conflict with a NATO intervention in 1999 on behalf of Kosovo. However, in the last decade, American policies towards the Albanians have changed a lot, especially during the Trump administration. We have the top leadership of the Albanians, from the president of Kosovo to the head of the parliament, who have been jailed in The Hague with the blessing of the Americans. And also in Albania, the Americans, they are attacking our president and our ex-president and prime minister and head of the opposition. There is an open rebellion against Americanism in Albania in particular, but even in neighboring Kosovo. Even though the situation now seems gloomy, like it is in Ukraine with the Zelenskys that the Americans have installed in power, I think there is hope for Albania. We have to keep in mind that majority of Albanians are Muslim. We are Sunni and we are Shia as well. And the historical connections that Albania had and has with the Muslim Ummah, with Turkey and Iran, cannot be outdone by terrorist groups like the Gulenists and the Munafiqins. So there is hope for Albania, and I would like to appeal to the Muslim Ummah not to forget Albania. After all, Albania is the oldest and the only fully recognized Muslim majority country in Europe. We are Europeans, and the presence of Islam in Albania cannot be outdone by the Americans. In the last decade, the Americans are trying to squeeze and destroy the influence of Turkey, Iran, but even of Arab countries in Albania. Nevertheless, they cannot outdo Islam. As we see now the situation with the defeat of NATO in Ukraine and with the raising of Russia and the end of the unipolar world where only Americans would dictate to the rest of the planet, I think, yes, there is hope for Albania. Albanian Muslims will re-establish their connections with the Muslim Ummah, and they will not allow their country to be used as a base against Islam. The presence of the Gulenists, but even of the Mujahedeens, is very much hated in the country. Even the kleptocratic system that the Americans have installed is hated, and I think that the change will come sooner or later.
Dr. Jazexhi, thank you so much for joining us. This was a very important subject, I think, which, it's like adding insult to injury. All these things happening in Albania, but also the media not covering it. So we were trying to shed light and give some insight to our audience about this very important part of the Muslim world and of Europe, this unique place where Europe and Islam are come together. And thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for giving us insight on this issue.
Thank you for having me.
So what insight did we gain from our conversation with Dr. Jazexhi? we learned that Albania is the only Muslim majority nation in Europe, with approximately 70% of the population declaring their adherence to this religion. This fact is precisely the reason that the US, European nations, and Israel have been particularly sensitive about Albania establishing close relations with other Muslim nations such as Iran, Turkey, or Saudi Arabia. Following the collapse of communism in the 1990s, there was a concerted effort by the US and its vassals to occupy Albania and the Albanian majority region of Kosovo in order to, first, strategically deny this Muslim majority nation and region to the Muslim Ummah and Muslim nations such as Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, with the usual fake excuse of fighting Islamic terrorism. Secondly, to use it as a platform and base for operations against Muslim countries, such as Iran, Turkey, and other Arab countries, by using a Muslim facade and establishing various terrorist cults and deviant sects who have declared war against the legitimate governments of some Muslim nations in Albania, in a policy that Dr. Jazexhi called turning Albania into Europe's garbage can. Thirdly, to weaponize legitimate Albanian nationalist feelings against Serbia and Russia, and in this way use Albania and Kosovo as a NATO base against Russia in Eastern Europe. In pursuit of these strategies, the US has bought and captured Albanian elites and has produced what Dr. Jazexhi has called our own little Zelenskys, in reference to the pro-Western Ukrainian leader elites who are basically just the executors of policies determined by the US Embassy and the Soros Foundation. As usual, America is its own worst enemy in the countries it tries to control by propping up corrupt leaders who eliminate peaceful political opponents and abuse human rights. And so we see the same pattern in Albania as we have seen in so many other Muslim nations, where the US supports corrupt and abusive elites, which results in turning the people of that nation against anything and anybody that has anything to do with the United States. Just like the atheist communist dictatorship failed over decades to extinguish the light of Islam and the connection of the Albanians with their fellow Muslim brethren of the Ummah, so too is the current US-Israeli strategy to de-Islamize and weaponize Albania for their own strategic goals doomed to failure, because it is contrary to the deep-held religious beliefs and national interests of the Albanian people. Thank you for joining us on this episode. Until the next time, on Insight.